All right. Live. Okay. Part 2. Welcome in. Thank you for watching. Okay. That's delicious. Finish you later. All right. Okay. Here is to truth without fear, faith without pretense, and beer without regret. Cheers. Okay. I got so worried about writing this because we will all have to give an account for every word we say. And I have spent many nights thinking about the implications for a video like this. And it's by conviction that I press record. For I believe sincerely that this is the most important message of the age, which is to get ready for the great chastisement that Our Lady of Fatima warned us about. Okay, so as we move forward in the Vatican Bank scandal, I want you to keep one thing in mind. Well, multiple things, but for right now, is that so many people or men involved in these crimes, these financial manipulators, these power brokers, are the same men tied to the networks of predation. A lot of them are pedophiles. Archbishop Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, he was a credibly accused pedophile. That's what binds them together. It's not ideology. It's not theology. It is a sex cult. And it's a cult that stretches far beyond the walls of the church into the upper ranks of politics, to finance, media, corporations, the military. It's one big club. And that club is now the world's elite. Blood for power. So now, for the sake of this talk, I don't want to spend too long discussing and dissecting every financial crime in the Vatican's long history. But I do want to give you a comprehensive overview so that you can see how the Vatican functions today as the world's moral facade for financial corruption, being a sovereign entity within a sovereign state. The Vatican is the washing machine for the global crime syndicate. The Vatican is not the head of the snake. It's not even the most powerful player in the room, but it is an essential spoke in the wheel. An unfortunate disguise through which some of the darkest financial crimes of modern age has passed unnoticed and protected by the institution that will not tolerate criticism. And when you zoom in on specific periods of history, when you trace those patterns, you'll start to see it. Although it seems impossible to expose it in its entirety, the devastation caused by these financial schemes is undeniable. So catastrophic are their effects that the Vatican's involvement in global finance has, in many ways, has destroyed more lives than it's helped. And that's a difficult possibility to hear, but it's one that we must face, especially if we have any hope for this to turn around. And that's why I'm saying this, to convince you, not with hysteria, or as Pope Francis calls us, shit eaters, but to disclose the reality of our church with reason. And that the only real path forward is for the church to renounce her temporal wealth and power, to strip herself of the gold and the politics and return to the poverty of the gospel. Because only in that poverty can she rediscover her purity, her humility, and the radiance that Christ held in poverty. Now, to understand the gravity of the Vatican's financial corruption, we have to accept that this isn't new. This isn't a sudden fall from grace. This is an unfortunate type of crime that stretches back centuries. To take a microscope to the crimes of the Medicis, the Orsinis, and the corrupted curia of the 13th century, to try and trace every coin and ledger would be futile. Those trails might be lost to history. But we know the sins of simony and nepotism. Avarice has been the root cause of the church's problems since Constantine, and it's only gotten worse each century. Where things become more visible and more easily tracked with the paper trail is after World War II. That's when the Vatican's financial apparatus was rebuilt under various shell companies, became entangled in the rise of global capitalism, intelligence operations, and the reorganization of power in the West. When you examine that period, a depressing image emerges, especially as you realize that the bad guys won the war, that the actions of the Vatican are not of a holy city guiding the world towards peace, but of an institution whose vaults became a financial node for the world's blood and drug money. Through the Vatican Bank, the church began serving as the banker for governments, corporations, and cartels, which are one and the same at this point. So let's address the major players on the board, which is the Vatican, which is the CIA, which is the unification of the Jewish mob with the Italian mafia. And the mafia here are essentially the Masonic arm. It's the governments of Latin America, the Middle East, Russia, and almost every country in Europe. And at the very top of all these players are the ones who carry the most wealth and the most power through global think tanks like the Council of Foreign Relations, the top bankers of the world, the Rothschilds, the Goldman Sachs, the Warburgs, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, all guide the geopolitical landscape, making the calls of which country or which leader falls. It's the bankers who decide if the Pope should be killed. And through the CIA and other syndicates, their will is carried out. A side note for a side quest, at the close of World War II, no one saw the aftermath, the crimes, the narrative more clearly laid out than General Patton. When he arrived in Nuremberg at the close of the war, he declared that the U.S. has fought the wrong enemy. He went public in saying that the U.S. should turn around and support the Germans in an attempt to stop the spread of communism. General Patton watched the Nuremberg trials and claimed that they were illegitimate, and he became a large and influential voice in the attempt for America to quickly respond to the Soviet threat before they took any more power. General Patton was murdered shortly after, and then history was written by the victors of the war. And what is coming to light today is the somber realization that the bad guys won the war. The international clique of bankers who presided within Washington and Wall Street and London and Moscow has successfully destroyed the biggest threat to a connected international global banking order. And those who fought against them were fighting for nationalism and sovereignty, the resistance to a one world financial institution under the Rothschild banking dynasty. After the Second World War, the world entered into what might be called the Great Reordering. The bombs stopped falling, but the real war for global domination only intensified. And in that new world, the errors of communism, warned of by Our Lady at Fatima, were unleashed like a plague across the nations. Marx's poison began seeping into every corner of the earth through revolutions, infiltrations, and people's movements that on the surface promised equality, but in practice delivered tyranny and mass slaughter. In the Cold War years, country after country fell to the wrath of Marx. But here's what I hope you come to understand. In these wars, the clash of ideologies that can be read about in history books, there exists something far more sinister beneath that surface. And I'll put it to you this way. The Cold War was a psychological operation for the globe. It's called controlled opposition. On the small scale, it looks like Coca-Cola versus Pepsi. Two competing brands, but both are owned by the same companies, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. It looks like Fox News versus CNN. Two networks screaming at each other on air while cashing checks from the same advertisers, acting out the words written by the same authors, and have the same big three owners, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Look up the "This is extremely dangerous to our democracy" video, and you'll see what I mean. The point is, the illusion of competition hides the reality of coordination. Now expand that to the world stage, and you can see the same pattern. Capitalism versus communism. Two apparent enemies locked in a Cold War death struggle, but both ultimately are given money to operate by the same exact banks, both nurtured, financed, and guided by the same international hands to bring about the same end: a one world government, a centralized economy, technocratic, and godless. Communism was the villain that the world could see, the boogeyman that needed to be stopped. And capitalism was the hero that the world would be obliged to trust. But both were controlled opposition to push everyone into the adoption of a unified world. When communism began to spread across Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America, entire governments were destabilized. People were terrified, and rightfully so. But this fear became the most useful weapon in the op, because in the name of stopping communism, the United States government, under the influence of the same global bankers who financed the communists, began to overthrow sovereign nations around the world. They toppled regimes, replaced leaders, and installed puppet cabinets, not to preserve freedom, as it was framed, but to centralize control and to have sovereign nations adopt the international banking system, taking all of them off the gold standard and on an interest-based usury system. This was the great tactic: create the enemy, then use the enemy's shadow as justification for your own empire. This is how the globalists, the real architects behind the curtain, infiltrated every government on earth. After you topple the monarchy, you establish the democracy. Then you can overthrow the democracy. And they played both sides of the board. And the citizens, our grandfathers, were collateral. Operations like these are not political strategy. They are satanic theater. They require the death of millions. They demand complicity, the kind of obedience that comes from people who believe the lie that the government is the good guy. But when you re-examine history and you really look at it, you notice something haunting: that the official good guys and the bad guys often change places once you see who's pulling the strings. All right, let's pivot, but on the same subject. To run global covert wars, especially across Latin America and Europe, you need money without oversight. You need untraceable cash, funds that no auditor, no Congress, no nation could account for. That's how black operations work. The books must be blank, the hands invisible. And for this story, that began shortly after World War II. The newly formed CIA studied the model of the opium trade in China and saw how profitable drug addiction could be. So they borrowed the model. The CIA started importing and distributing heroin in America's poorest ghettos, known as Operation X, officially to manage the opium trade in Vietnam. And what began as a national security experiment turned into an epidemic. Before the war, fewer than 20,000 heroin addicts existed in the entire United States. Within 2 decades, that number exploded into millions. Millions of souls shackled to chemical chains. All part of a government strategy to raise untraceable funds and to weaken the social fabric of nations. This was the first documented union of organized crime and the intelligence community, a collaboration known as Operation Underworld. The CIA, the Italian Mafia, the Jewish mob, 3 heads to make one beast, fused into a single syndicate. They trafficked drugs, laundered money, moved arms, and assassinated threats, all under the pretense of national defense. And where does the Vatican fit into this web? The answer is at the center of the money, the laundering operation. Because for every black operation, for every drug and human shipment, for every covert deal, you need a way to clean the money. And no institution on earth offers cleaner laundering than a sovereign city-state protected by international immunity and sealed ledgers. And don't worry, I'll give you sources on this video later. There are many dark corridors that one could explore within Vatican history, unfortunately, and each revealing its own level of complicity. But for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on a single thread that ties directly into the Vatican Bank scandal, a thread that shows the Vatican not as an innocent bystander, but as an active financial partner in the evil machine of global corruption. After I take a quick drink of beer. Cheers. Okay. So, the early 1940s, the Second World War was near the end, and another war was already beginning. The newly formed American Intelligence Service, the OSS, which would become the CIA, spread its reach across the globe. And if you've never heard of it, look into Operation Gladio. Paul Williams writes a compelling book on the subject. Right here. Gladio is named after a Roman dagger, and it's the alliance between the CIA, the Mafia, and the Vatican. Ultimately, it involves much more groups and people, but those are the big 3. Officially, the operation was conducted by NATO and the CIA to create stay-behind units in Europe to resist communist forces. What happened was that the CIA, with the help of the Mafia, conducted false flag terrorist attacks in various places, assassinated people who sought peace, like the Prime Minister Aldo Moro, and conducted sophisticated psychological operations through Catholic Action, and again committed many terrorist attacks of which they blamed the crimes on the communists, so that the people would find reason and a vote with the strong conservatives who were just other Freemasons, because they promised order. Under the banner of democracy, these operations were carried out all over the world. And one of the masterminds behind Operation Gladio was Paul Helliwell. Yes, he is a ethnic JJ. And he was watching the heroin trade in China. And what he observed was how the anti-heroin Chinese National Army, the KMT, sold opium to the population in order to raise funds for military operations. And this idea was presented to General William Donovan and Allen Dulles, the same guys who helped kill General Patton. Eventually, the means to fund Operation Gladio and future operations was set. Their own drug operations and networks, and they began selling heroin shipped from China to the ghettos of America. And once the plans were drafted, the contacts had to be made. Once the Mafia connection was dispatched, Earl Brennan, the OSS director in Italy, reached out to Monsignor Giovanni Montini, the Undersecretary of State at the Vatican, later Pope Paul VI. With this meeting, Montini introduced the OSS to Don Carlo, the boss of the bosses, the head of the Vizzini Agostino crime family in Sicily. And all these men would meet at the Vatican. All of these men, the CIA directors, the mafia bosses, would be given the Grand Cross of the Order of St. Sylvester, one of the oldest and most prestigious papal knighthoods. They ate, they drank, and they made the deal. So from there, the CIA began working with the mafia and the Jewish mob within America. Lucky Luciano with the mafia and Meyer Lansky with the mob. Through Operation Underworld, the CIA and organized crime became one unit to stop communism. One note I'd like to add to remember is that essentially every high-level member of the mafia are Freemasons. Try not to picture the Godfather type characters. Yes, they are Italian, but within the storyline, if someone is not of ethnic descent, like Meyer Lansky or Paul Helliwell or Lawrence Tisch, then he's a Freemason. The Jewish Masonic conspiracy is at the heart of it, expressed by St. Maximilian Kolbe, who before the war, he claimed that there was a plot to infiltrate the church. And by his time, the church was already infiltrated. Go watch my video on how Kolbe actually died. In 1942, Pope Pius XII created a new institution, the IOR, the Vatican Bank, a state within a state, answerable only to the papacy. And from the beginning of its charter, guaranteed secrecy. Records could be destroyed at will. Transactions concealed behind the shield of sovereignty. It was perfect. An instrument beyond the jurisdiction of any nation. The bank was structured with 3 boards, one of cardinals, one of international bankers, and one of Vatican officials. And with the mafia controlling the Italian ports, the operation began. Drugs were being shipped from China and sold to the mean streets of inner city America. The money collected was sent to the Vatican, who would then make deposits into various offshore shell companies, charities, and various banks that they owned in Italy and around the world. The CIA needed untraceable funds for its covert wars. The mafia needed a place to clean its profits from narcotics and the black market trade. The Vatican Bank became their partner. Each transfer came with a stiff service fee to the Vatican, a 15% commission. And the newly laundered money was then filtered through different shell companies, like Castle Bank in the Bahamas, that was set up by Paul Helliwell. I'll say it again. When drugs were being sold in Harlem, they would use men like Albert Caron, a New York police officer who served as the bagman and would pay officials to look away. That drug money would be collected and shipped in large suitcases from New York, Miami, New Orleans, and shipped to Italy, where the unloaded duffel bags would be sent directly to the Vatican, where priests would take and deposit. And I will detail the laundering more, but for now, this was a consistent flow. And this money would be deposited from the Vatican into various shell companies, banks, charities they owned. And they would use to clean this money to pay for political campaigns. 2 examples: the CIA created or relaunched the Christian Democrat Party and Catholic Action, both political propaganda machines to sell the narrative. While the CIA and Mafia committed acts of terror, these organizations were there to blame the communists in the press. As the operations continued, the demand for cash increased, and the plan to push heroin into new markets within the U.S. developed. By the early 1950s, via Operation X, the CIA was running heroin from China to America in order to pay for military operations all over Latin America and other parts of the world. Other venues, known as Operation Paper, would eventually be coined into what was called the military-industrial complex, which relied on privatized military and intelligence contractors, international bankers, and the most organized lobbyists in Washington. And as the world became inundated with heroin, the CIA placed the blame on People's Republic of China and framed General Fao as America's best hope in combating the drug problem. The opposite was true, and this was the first false flag operation on Americans, when in 1953, the CIA initiated Operation Mockingbird, which involved recruiting leading journalists and editors to fabricate stories and create smokescreens in order to cast their agenda in a positive light. As the CIA was making billions from selling drugs to Americans, they worked in tandem with a man named Henry Manfredi, who established the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who also established close ties with Monsignor Montini, Pope Paul VI, who was managing the direct flow of cash from the mafia to the banks. As with what seems to be normal procedure in the church promotion, elevating the bad dudes, Montini was appointed Archbishop of Milan, and his connections strengthened the operation. And here's the source. Per Douglas Valentine, who wrote The Strength of the Wolf, the definitive history on the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he is as reliable as the sources you can get. Narcotics agents and CIA agents like Victor Marchetti detail in testimony how Montini was making millions of dollars for his efforts in laundering activities. Couple this source with the Italian Parliament inquiry in the Vatican Bank scandal, public, and you connect those two and you get the picture of Montini's involvement. The growing nexus between the CIA and the Mafia and the Vatican was Massimo Spalda and Michele Sindona, who became known as God's banker. And he, along with Archbishop Marcinkus, created these various shell companies, the financial pipeline that would feed the banks. And it's this relationship right here that would facilitate into wholesale slaughter of false flag events, and that would be blamed on the communists, the toppling of real governments around the world, and widespread drug and financial devastation for real families. It's not romantic like Hollywood wants you to perceive it. It's wicked. Also, keep in mind that even though I only mentioned a few men from the Vatican, there were thousands of clerics who were involved in these operations all over the world. Some helped due to blackmail or obedience, or helped because they were part of that lavender mafia and wanted to make money. I will concede that perhaps many helped probably because they were just foot soldiers and they believed they were helping the efforts to stop communism, not knowing that the anti-communist leadership and policy was coming out of the P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy. Regardless, the cardinals and archbishops likely all knew the scope, because it is difficult to believe that Pope Pius XII, Pope John XXIII, Paul VI, all the way up to Pope Francis, were blissfully unaware that the majority of the church dignitaries were practicing Freemasons. And the fact that the popes elevated these clerics to higher positions after learning of their Masonic membership is equally mind-boggling. Or how literal mafia bankers would be crowned princes of the church and personally given medals as Knights of Malta by the popes. So, all right. So as the 60s approach, in the background of the Vatican laundering money for the CIA, Pope John XXIII is playing along. But at this stage, scandal doesn't break out. The money moves around the world quietly, and so he focuses on something far more destructive. The year 1960 is the date that Our Lady gave instructions to the church to open the third and final secret of Fatima. Only, in 1960, the Pope disobeyed the mandate from heaven and kept the message sealed. Along with defying the instructions of Our Lady, Pope John the 23rd set out to do what the Freemasons have sought officially to destroy since the French Revolution. As the Pope introduced the Second Vatican Council, he said, "We feel we must disagree with those prophets of gloom, who are always forecasting disaster, as though the end of the world were at hand." Pope John, named after the Pope who burned Franciscans alive, opened the Second Vatican Council, a reform meant to renew the faith, but after 60 years shows that it was meant to destroy it. After a successful lobby by the Americans, with the help of Cardinal Spellman, the Jeffrey Epstein, and the American Church, after him, Montini ascended the throne to become Pope Paul VI, and he would finish the greatest assault on the faith in the history of the Church. This was one of the worst men the Church has ever seen, and you must think I'm some kind of stupid if you expect me to call him a saint. My problem, my grievance, is that the greatest villains of not only the Church, but of human history, the men who dared to change sacred liturgy, the greatest perpetrators to the bride of Christ, are the ones declaring themselves saints. You got to put your big boy pants on and realize just how bad this crisis is. When Paul VI was in, he crystallized 3 prominent creators of the Novus Ordo, and I will explain these sources later. But these architects of the new liturgy, of the new rites, the new relationship with the other religions of the world, they were all Freemasons. The leader and final editor to the Novus Ordo was Cardinal Bonini. He was a Freemason. Per other good bishops like Marcel Lefebvre, Bonini threw out years of work by them, and after the original vote of approval, everything was gutted and taken out of the original work. Cardinal Bea, the creator of Nostra Aetate, the outspoken modernist, a participant in Operation Gladio, was a Freemason. When Paul became Pope, one of his first acts was to appoint Licio Gelli, a mafia banker and Grand Master of the P2 Lodge, who also became a knight in the Order of St. Sylvester. Pope Paul is also the one who brought in Archbishop Marcinkus as the head of the IOR Vatican Bank. And the 3 of them would work to open up rat lines in Europe to smuggle money and soldiers for the CIA. Gelli would bring Montini hundreds of millions of gold bars from various crime families and cash from drug runs to be deposited into the Vatican Bank. And 2 other close players with Montini during this period was Cardinal Leccaro, who also became one of the moderators in the Second Vatican Council, and Monsignor Casaroli, who later became the Vatican Secretary of State under JP2, who was also on the infamous Freemason list that we will soon discuss. These members from the Vatican Curia bound themselves to uphold the purpose of the Masonic craft, which is the creation of an international brotherhood of men, bound in fellowship and pledged to mutual aid, religious toleration, and political reform. The same purpose for the creation of the Vatican Council. And it is through this alliance of the CIA, the Mafia, and the Vatican that these individuals, primarily Gelli, these 3 would set up the P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy. This lodge was distinct because many of its members were mafiosi, military officers, politicians, and so on. It was distinctly clandestine in nature and set up by these 3 groups. And Gelli would create P2 lodges all over Europe, all over South America and the United States. And it would include members of various high-level people. And how do we know this? What's the source? We know this because of two recorded events that happened to Gelli. These events would be years later, but in 1981, when the Vatican bank scandal was breaking by various journalists, Licio Gelli's villa in Tuscany got raided. When the police were looking for bank transfers and ledgers, they unexpectedly found a list that contained over 900 names of prominent P2 Masonic members, which revealed an extensive secret network composing of politicians, military officers, judges, bankers, businessmen, military journalists, and clergy. These names were released to the public. It's still public. And it resulted in the collapse of the government of Arnoldo Forlani. And it was this event, which is well known in Italy, and people were outraged to learn that the most powerful members of society were part of this espionage. And this discovery is what brought down most of the Italian government and led to a full inquiry by the Italian parliament. Through these publicly available documents, they detail the P2 Masonic Lodge connection to various intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA, and the money laundering through the Vatican Bank. This commission defined P2 as a secret criminal organization. The second event happened a year later when Gelli's daughter was making a run for it. She was arrested at an airport in Rome in 1982, and the false bottom of her suitcase had 5 folders of documents that revealed that the P2 Lodge was a CIA proxy, which had CIA links to multiple acts of terror in Italy and Latin America and the Western world, all with the blessings of the Vatican. There was a 10-page manifesto drafted by Licio discussing media consolidation, union suppression, and how to run and manipulate presidential elections. Pages that detailed slush funds and bribery networks, written plots to destabilize the governments in Venezuela and Argentina via terrorism and propaganda. And again, the Vatican was in there with its fingerprints all over it. This was one of the key events that led to the investigation into Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank, and the arrest warrants of several IOR members, including Archbishop Marcinkus. That's a source. The P2 lodges were set up all over the world in this period of time. As the investigators of the Italian bank scandal were uncovering the confiscated documents, they started learning about a sprawling intelligence operation that spread across continents. One of the hotspots of the CIA operation was in Argentina, under the watchful eye of the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and the head of the Jesuit order during the years of lead was Jorge Bergoglio, the future Pope Francis. And as the head of the church in Argentina, these covert networks thrived. Bergoglio was positioned right where the church, the dictators, and the intelligence services intersected. Whether as a participant, an observer, or an intermediary, history is still debating. But this brings us to the idea of controlled opposition, an important concept to grasp. In these years of the Dirty War, both sides of the political aisle were being manipulated by the forces that used chaos and control to gain the same end. On one side, you had the leftist revolutionaries, Marxist movements rising up against the entrenched powers, promising liberation. On the other side, there were the conservative governments, supposedly the defenders of freedom, but they were in reality backed and guided by the CIA under the name Operation Condor. Operation Condor was not just a military pact. It was an intelligence conspiracy, an alliance uniting right-wing dictatorships across South America. The mission? Eradicate communism. Their methods was kidnapping, torture, and assassinations. Hundreds of thousands were killed or disappeared. The tragedy and reality is that ordinary people were trapped between two options nobody wanted. On one side, you had Marxist insurgents sought to topple governments through revolution. On the other side, U.S.-supported regimes waged a holy war in defense of capitalism and Western order. The middle ground, the majority, the nationalists, the independents, the people who wanted sovereignty and a return to hard money, a gold-backed economy, they were crushed by both sides. Neither side truly served the people. Both sides served the machine of the central banks. The Vatican's role in all of this deliberately remains murky. What I do know is that every major phase of Operation Condor received approval from the papacy. Pope Paul VI offered blessings in many languages of anti-communism, providing moral cover for the brutality carried out in the name of God and stability. Years later, when General Pinochet finally faced trial in 2005, accused of torture and cruel murder of thousands, he didn't argue his innocence. Instead, he presented a letter from Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the Vatican Secretary of State, written on behalf of the Pope, demanding the general's release. The dirty war is a thick and tangled story. It's far too complex to unpack here, and I'm still learning a lot. But within it stands one key figure, Pope Francis. During those years, he wasn't the Pope yet, but he was the Jesuit provincial of Argentina, the superior of his order. Again, whether he was complicit by silence, or simply caught in the storm of history, that question is still being talked about. But during this time, 8 Jesuit priests came forward in court with accusations. They claimed in court that Bergoglio himself, the then head of the Jesuit order in Argentina, had betrayed them, handing them over to the death squads that operated under the military junta. These priests were taken to ESMA, the Navy Mechanic School, a place that today is well known for its gulag-type cruelty. Inside ESMA, torture wasn't just physical, it was psychological, spiritual. In there, families were torn apart in front of one another. Children were made to watch their parents beaten, mutilated, and killed. And parents were forced to watch their children tortured to death in front of them. And in there were priests, right there, participating in the warfare. It was hell in there. In 2005, a human rights group filed a criminal suit against Bergoglio for crimes against humanity. But, being a Vatican official, he escaped accountability. He was shielded by diplomatic immunity. Under Argentine law, he could not be prosecuted. And this wasn't an isolated event. Across the years, much like the abuse scandals that we have discussed in America, Bergoglio was accused of covering up abuse. And not only of sexual misconduct, he protected evil men. Evil. Such as Father Christian von Warnich, a priest and military chaplain who finally went to prison in 2007 for 31 counts of child torture, 7 homicides, 42 kidnappings. Who knows what the real number was? Now, people often say, extraordinary claims requires extraordinary proof. And they're right, in theory. But when accusations rise against powerful men, popes, generals, presidents, that proof rarely sees the light of day, because those who hold the evidence, those who have courage to speak, too often end up suicided, dead. That's what happened to Natasha Jate a prostitute who went public and appeared on television in Argentina in 2019, accusing Bergoglio and the anti-trafficking politician Gustavo Vera of the involvement of human trafficking. On air, she claimed to have gathered evidence she planned to present in court. Shortly afterward, she warned the public on social media that her life was in danger. A week later, she was found dead, a cocaine overdose, just before her testimony, and the case has been quietly closed. These are the patterns that go from Buenos Aires to Rome, from the Vatican to the CIA. And that's the point. By this stage in history, those who rise to the highest positions of authority, whether in politics, religion, or finance, often do so not in spite of the darkness, but through it. They ascend through the dark channels. By the time we enter the 70s, the intelligence strategies in Latin America shifted from traditional warfare to an economic and narcotics-based operation. Under the Banzer Plan in Bolivia and the broader network, they had established trade routes from Operation Condor. Cocaine production and trafficking in the regions expanded tenfold. The anti-communist objectives and drug routes became intertwined. The same supply chains that moved weapons south began moving cocaine north. And independent journalists, including Gary Webb, a LA narcotics detective who later provoked a Senate review, reported that pilots such as Barry Seal, operating out of Mena, Arkansas, were figures in covert shipments that linked Latin American cartels with the U.S. markets. According to Webb's reporting and declassified congressional testimony, profits from these networks helped fund various off-book intelligence operations. Several financial investigations at the time pointed to evidence that large sums of cartel cash were laundered through offshore banks in Panama and the Bahamas. Publications and court documents have named institutions such as Cispline Bank and Castle Bank, which were created by Paul Hellawell and tied to Michele Sindona and Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, IOR. These accounts sent criminal funds through layers of shell companies and charitable fronts before reaching European financial centers in Switzerland. Through clergy like Archbishop Hoyos of Colombia, who was close to Pablo Escobar, he would facilitate the transfer of funds to the Vatican, where they were happily accepting a 15% service fee for the cocaine funds from Pablo Escobar. Quick break. All right. A quick, big picture snapshot on this, so I can help the desensitized audience grasp why this is really bad. While the CIA was shaping public opinion through the media via Operation Mockingbird, they were also influencing the population to reshape their values. Hedonism, the glamour of sex and drug use, and the consumer attraction of a good time filtered into pop culture. By steering culture, you steer the moral destiny and compliance. The rock and rap industry was propped up by the CIA to influence generations, and the drug epidemics rose and ravaged American cities. This was statecraft, a feedback loop to get people to buy more drugs to pay for more wars around the world. And let's not fail to mention one more important element that is forbidden to discuss. The cocaine industry has a market value of about $140 billion per year. The heroin industry has a market cap about $80 billion per year. The market value of human trafficking, sex, and forced labor is about 500 billion per year. And the thing you all need to understand is that the money laundering within the Vatican isn't for drugs exclusively. It's to launder the black market funds. The largest product in the black market is not drugs, it's people, it's children. And the US government has been accused by many dead men for being the largest trafficking organization in the world. Use your heads. If the official numbers by the State Departments are that over 1 million kids are trafficked every year, those numbers do not happen unless the government, corporate, and religious institutions are behind it. One break. Ugh. All right. Excuse me. The Vatican Bank scandal didn't explode into the public's attention all at once. It was a slow leak. In Italy, during the late 1970s, just a few brave journalists began to pull at the threads connecting the Vatican's finances to organized crime. These were not reckless conspiracy theorists. Many were respected investigative reporters and economists, and for exposing too much, many of them paid with their lives. Front page headlines began appearing in major Italian newspapers, warning that the church's financial arm, the IOR, had become entangled with the Masonic mafia. And the public was shocked. The Vatican was supposed to be sacred ground, not a financial partner to the same institutions that ran Wall Street. Articles called urgently for reform, for transparency, for the church to sever its ties with global central banks. But that certainly wasn't going to happen under the current pontificate, who organized the relationships with the CIA and the mafia in the first place. But then came 1978, a potential turning point, when Pope Paul VI died. By this time, the scandal was already gathering public notoriety. The sudden collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, one of the largest private banks in Italy, exposing billions of dollars missing from its accounts. And wherever the investigators looked, the same names kept appearing. Vatican officials, mafiosi financiers, high-ranking members of the P2 Masonic Lodge, Italian prosecutors, and judges who pursued the case were literally gunned down in the streets. One of them, Judge Emilio Alessandrini, had been investigating the financial dealings of Banco Ambrosiano when the judge was murdered in traffic in broad daylight. And then there was Mino Pecorelli. Remember the name. He's a good source. He was a decorated journalist, a Bronze Star recipient in the war, a lawyer who went into investigative journalism, then turned whistleblower. Pecorelli was the insider who published an expose naming 121 members of the P2 Lodge, a list that included Vatican officials. Send me a DM on Instagram, and I'll send you a PDF of the original article. This is the list that made its way to the desk of Pope John Paul I, just weeks before his sudden death. Pecorelli himself was killed after. He was executed with 3 shots to the back and 1 to the mouth. The killers left the symbol of stones in the mouth, a mafia culture meaning he had broken the oath of silence, because Mino Pecorelli was one of them. He was a member of P2 who decided to reveal that brotherhood. When John Paul I succeeded Paul VI, he inherited a church at war with its own members. One of his first actions was to request an internal report on the Vatican Bank's finances. Of the roughly 11,000 active accounts, only 1,600 could be traced to genuine ecclesiastical or charitable purposes. The remaining 9,400, nearly 85%, were funding and functioning as private or institutional slush funds. Many of these were reported to be linked to mafia and intel networks and covert political operations. I won't go into all 121 names, but you can find it online pretty easily. I do want to name a few that will be familiar to many. Don't forget the subculture of these men. Most of them lived double lives. They have their public appearance, and then they have their other shadow. The abuses to each other and to children, and to the faithful Catholics around the world whom they subvert through insidious teachings. The top of the list, Archbishop Annibale Bugnini, the architect of Vatican II, the man who drafted and oversaw the final liturgical changes, the man who changed many octaves and vigils, changing the code of rubrics, the man who gave us the Novus Ordo liturgy was a Freemason. I'll say it again. The Novus Ordo Mass was written by a Freemason whose intent was to destroy Catholicism. Whatever you feel about the new Mass doesn't change that the origins and nature and intent of it was to destroy our faith. Next to him, the other key members who worked on the Vatican II reform was Cardinal No, head of the Sacred Congregation of Divine Worship. He was a Freemason. Cardinal Roberto Tucci, Jesuit, Director General of Vatican Radio, Freemason. Cardinal Joseph Suinins, another moderator of Vatican II, Freemason. Cardinal Bea, the Jesuit, who was the main author of Nostra Aetate, the new spirit of ecumenism, the new official Catholic relation with the Jews, which gave us for the first time in history of the church the claim that they are God's chosen people, post-resurrection. Cardinal Bea was a Freemason. Cardinal Castoroli, a key diplomat during the Cold War with Russia, who later became the most powerful person next to the Pope as Secretary of State under John Paul II, was a Freemason. Cardinal Villot, who was the Secretary of State under Paul VI and John Paul I, one of the main characters in the Vatican bank scandals, was a Freemason. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, President of the Vatican Bank, Mason. Monsignor Pasquale Macchi, Pope Paul VI's personal secretary from 1954 to 1978, Mason. Cardinal Baggio, President of the Pontifical Commission of the Vatican State, Mason. Cardinal Poletti, President of the Pontifical Works and of the Liturgical Academy, Mason. I named 11 out of 121, and this is only from the P2 Lodge. There were many other secret societies in Italy with far darker practices. But when you see that the men who literally control the whole church are Masons, I hope you comprehend the level of the infiltration. And no, their Masonic membership was not a good old boys club for the purpose of social connections. These men serve Lucifer intentionally. Their belief of him is the same as all the other esoteric societies, how they view the angel of light. They view him the way John Milton portrays him in Paradise Lost, that Lucifer is a misunderstood angel who is actually here to liberate mankind from the shackles of the grip of the medieval Catholicism. These Masons believe that man is self-sufficient, that man has the power of God within himself, and if he but pursues the right path of knowledge and enlightenment, he can be like God. I recently listened to a Chinese communist professor attempting to break this down by saying God is the one who is trying to enslave humanity. This professor brought up how the serpent in the garden was trying to free Adam and Eve, and it was God who prevented this because God didn't want Adam to live forever like him. He quoted Genesis chapter 3, verse 22, saying, Then the Lord God said, "See, this man has become like one of us, knowing what is good and what is bad. Therefore, he must not be allowed to put out his hand to take from the tree of life, and thus eat of it and live forever." This professor said, "You see, here is the proof that they were expelled from the garden, and Lucifer was just trying to help man break from the shackles of mortality and wanted to show them the path to enlightenment." And fun fact, the origins of that esoteric path to knowledge and enlightenment comes from the Kabbalah, the Sephiroth. And it is the teachings of Lucifer to be like God, without God. What this professor fails to understand was that God was protecting humans, and the exclusion from the garden was an act of mercy, because to live forever in a corrupted state of sin and disobedience to the Creator would be a cursed and painful existence rather than a blessing. Mankind is not permitted to grasp immortality in his fallen condition by his own will, which is why God became man and redeemed man. The universe has laws. One law is free will, and another law is that atonement for sin requires blood. And God used his blood to redeem man. We will live forever, but we can only live forever when we submit ourselves to the will of the one who made us live forever. What these men have become, these Masons, is prideful. And over the course of their lives, they became influenced by power, seeking more wealth and influence. Eventually, they fell into the worst sins one can commit, thanks to the culture that bred it in them. They fell into their own pursuit, and at some point, whatever that time, they joined the ranks of Lucifer. Many bishops today are atheists. They don't even believe in God. But many other bishops believe the serpent over God. They believe that through their achievements on earth, they can achieve God status in the next life. They believe that the right path is the Masonic path, which is a universal brotherhood, a universal religion where all religions are equal. They seek universal enlightenment, and by their efforts, they are awarded with all the fruits that this world can offer. The men who have gained temporal power in the church serve Lucifer. They say inverted black masses. They sacrifice children. They pursue a different path and have succeeded in one of the worst events that can happen on earth. They created a new liturgy that aligns with their Masonic ideals, that of a universal brotherhood, and a church that proclaims that all religions are a path to God. That is the satanic word, ecumenism. When Pope John Paul I received the internal report on the Vatican Bank's finances, reportedly he was stunned, according to the testimony of his personal secretaries. Accounts circulated later among the Vatican that he had resolved to demand resignations from several senior clerics and to begin financial reforms. Word of these intentions leaked almost immediately into the corridors, fueling anxiety among those who feared exposure. And according to official record, a week before his death, the Pope visited his personal physician. The doctor's notes describe no heart disease, only mild low blood pressure, well controlled with medication. By every account, the pontiff was in good spirits. He exercised daily. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, and was considered to be in excellent health. But then, just 33 days after his election, the world awoke to shocking news. Pope John Paul I was dead. He was 65 years old. And here's how it went down. At about 4:30 a.m. on September 29th, Sister Taffarel, who brought the Pope his morning coffee, left a tray outside his door as usual. When she returned, half an hour later, and saw it untouched, Concerned, after no responses to her knocking, she entered the room. The Pope was seated, upright in bed, papers scattered around him. And as soon as she approached him, Sister Taffarel fell back in horror. Her testimony was that the Pope's lips were pulled back in a grimace face, and his gums were exposed, and his eyes appeared to have popped from their sockets. She immediately called the papal secretary, Father John Maggi, who in turn notified Cardinal Jean Vallot, the Vatican Secretary of State, and Freemason. From this moment, the story becomes clouded and little contradictions. Different witnesses recalled different sequences of events. Cardinal Vallot reportedly instructed those present to prevent anyone from entering the papal apartment until he arrived. When he did, 30 minutes later, around 5 a.m., he collected various personal items, including the documents and medications, none of which were ever seen again. And at this point in the story, Sister Taffarel was quietly sent to her previous cloister against her wishes. She was forbidden to speak to anyone about the event and died a few years later. Let's go back. At 5:45 a.m., the papal physician, Dr. Renato Buzonetti, confirmed the death. By 6 a.m., just an hour later, the Signoracci brothers, official Vatican undertakers, had began the embalming process. Traditionally, popes' bodies are not embalmed, but even if they are, the standard process is to drain the blood. However, the two brother morticians began to embalm the Pope in his bed, preventing any ability for autopsy to determine the actual cause of death. The Holy See later stated that the Pope had suffered a massive heart attack. Considering his medical history, many were unconvinced. Over the years, journalists and authors have pointed to inconsistencies in the Vatican's official timeline, small lies that contradict simple events, to the disappearance of key papers as evidence that something more complex might have occurred. The deaths of several bankers and international criminals linked to the Banco Ambrosiano affair, including Roberto Calvi, who was found hanging under the London's Blackfriars Bridge 4 years later, only deepened public suspicion that the Vatican's financial scandals and the sudden death of John Paul I's papacies were connected. That and many Vatican officials and the CIA stood to lose everything if the bank reform took place, for the Vatican was operating as the washing machine for the world crime syndicate. And so, John Paul I died, leaving his short attempt to correction to his predecessor, the man who some claimed was lobbied by the CIA, by the assistance of Cardinal Cody in Chicago and Cardinal Kroll of Philadelphia, and the help of other Masonic cardinals in the Curia. The junior cardinal from Poland came to the throne in under 2 days of balloting, Pope John Paul II. Once in place, the laundering returned back to business as usual. Cardinal Vallot remained Secretary of State. Archbishop Marcinkus remained the head of the IOR. Ties to Roberto Calvi and Licio Gelli and the CIA were renewed, and their sights were all set on the next phase of their operation, the Middle East. Quick drink break. In part of the many reasons the bankers wanted to get their hands on the Middle East was in part to dominate the region in support of the newly established State of Israel, which would serve purposes that we can see today. Other parts were to control the rich oil resources, and another part was due to the fact that the drought in Southeast Asia was crushing the poppy production for heroin. So the CIA planned to utilize the highlands of Afghanistan and Iran and other regions as their new source of drug revenue. In the 70s, poppy production was non-existent. the Afghan government was eradicating any production. In 2005, it was responsible for 95% of the world's opium production and dropped by 90% when the US left its occupation in 2021. This opium wasn't just used for illegal drug use. Big pharmaceutical companies like the Sacco family also made claims on the production for Oxycontin and other opium-based drugs. What I'm saying is the tip of the iceberg. One simple way to break it all down would be to explain it like this. During the French Revolution, the plan was to overthrow all the monarchs and establish democracies. World War I and World War II were fought to establish the global ruling force within the democracies that would elect them in. When the men who prevailed from the war were those who wanted to implement the international banking system. After World War II, the Cold War was a theater war, because as with all previous wars, both sides were funded by the Rothschild dynasty and their associated clique of bankers. The communists used the same Swiss bank accounts to launder and carry out their deeds. The same banks, J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, Goldman Sachs, Kuhn and Loeb, the Rothschilds, provided loans to the Soviets. They sold industry and energy to the Soviets. General Electric, Standard Oil, other big American companies assisted them in building up their grid, their oil extractions, and other industry development. By funding both sides of the Cold War conflict, the bankers and corporations made billions, and it consolidated global power into the hands of a few. The Soviets acted as the polar opposite to a stable world, and in playing the role of the global boogeyman, it collected global consent to centralize a world system like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and other international trade organizations. When the bankers controlled the Western governments and the Soviet regimes, as well as the media and how it frames each step to the public, the goal can be accomplished, which is the expansion of central banks globally, the control of the industrial growth around the world, and the forced direction of a militarized and technological advancement in the direction favorable to a corporate financial interest. The next phase is what we are seeing today. Now that the monarchies are gone, and now that the democracies are controlled by a few global think tanks like the UN, the Bilderberg Group, the Council of Foreign Relations, the world is seemingly distinct but united under a few corporate banners, and all of them are at the mercy of the central banks. What comes next is the further takeover via technology, via artificial intelligence, via digitizing everything, the stocks, digitizing the natural resources, your body, everything that is carbon-based will all become a digital token to be owned. Owned by who? Eventually, the bankers. What I hope everyone understands is that when you examine the books that investigate the World Crime Syndicate, you see quite clearly, especially as a Catholic, that there is an organized network that is vast, dark, and is working towards a unified world under one governance, under one monetary system, and under one law and one religion. What you need to understand is this network is in every major position of power. That since at least the mid-1700s, these societies have been working to infiltrate every layer of society, to subvert the whole world. The right arm of this body is the Freemasons and the various secular orders. The left arm of this body is the central banks. The head of this body is an old group of wise men who have been pushing this plan carefully over the centuries. Yes, most of them have the same ethnic origin. What is certain at this level, at the very top, they all serve the angel of illumination, Lucifer. When we stand and face the power that they wield, it's rational to conclude that it's over. It's all over. They have controlled the monopoly board for centuries. That unless there is a mass awakening and the people as one voice rise up and squash the central banks and every relevant figure around the world, there is little hope of stopping their plans to come to fruition, save only divine intervention. But this video is not to discuss how to stop the bankers from taking over the world, because it's already happening and it's a matter of divine providence, and the will of God is what will be done. We all know that the story of salvation history ends in persecution. We all know that there will someday be a formal Antichrist. Obviously, we don't know the day or the hour, but surely we can see what's unfolding in front of our eyes. We can see the consolidation of nations into one centralized power. We can see the rapid influence of artificial intelligence. We can see a near future of a one world currency. We know in the world today that we no longer live in a Christian society, and it's becoming increasingly hostile to the traditional faith. Our own Catholic faith has discarded the traditions and has forced our heads to turn towards ecumenism, which is the pretext to a one world religion. And worst of all, we can see the infiltration of our church. It's one thing for powerful men in the CIA to wage war to gain more power and influence over fellow men. It's another thing entirely when these men use the bride of Christ to do their bidding, and at the same time manipulated the minds of the faithful to slowly take away the faith of their children and their children's children. I want to draw a clear line, a distinction between the men of faith who built our tradition and the men within the Vatican who over generations have worked, knowingly or not, towards its undoing. To further understand how deep this goes, I want to turn back to the Masonic men who lost their way, to a document known as the Permanent Instruction of the Ultima Vendita. This text, discovered in the 1800s and then published to the public with papal approval decades later, offers a blueprint to their plans. And it doesn't speak of armies or assassins infiltrating seminaries in disguise. Nope, it's far more patient. It speaks of influence, of controlling ideas, not through violence, but through culture, through the ownership of the printing press and media, through the shaping of public opinion through education, through the molding of young minds. The goal was not to storm the church from the outside, but to cultivate within her walls a new generation, priests, teachers, leaders, who would carry the torch of those very ideals that sought to destroy her. The Grand Master authors of the Ultima Vendita laid out their ultimate objective plainly: the gradual and permanent destruction of the Catholic faith, not by burning churches, not by silencing prayers, but by conversion of the clergy themselves, a slow, almost invisible process by which the church would one day preach principles that mirrored the very philosophies it once condemned. This was to be a cultural war, fought with books, lectures, classrooms, the television screen. Over centuries, the strategy was to form minds, to raise generations so steeped in the new ideals that they would abandon the old without even realizing it. In later years, the Vatican insider and whistleblower, who I love, Malachi Martin, spoke about this transformation. He said that many bishops and theologians promoting new, liberalized doctrines truly believe they are the heroes, the reformers who are freeing the church from its rigid past. They see traditionalists as stubborn, uneducated, or backwards in thought. But Malachi Martin's warning was that these so-called reformers don't even realize that they've lost the faith, that they've been formed by the very cultural machinery designed to erase the sacred from the modern world. He described it as the greatest deception of all time, a church convinced it is evolving, when in truth it is dissolving. Wars like the First and Second World War were fought with tanks and soldiers, nation against nation, brother against brother. But what we face right now is a culture war, one that moves slowly, quietly, invisibly. It's infiltrated education, entertainment, and belief. It wins and claims its enemies by cunning persuasion. And we can see the aftermath all around us. Generations of Catholics who call themselves faithful, yet no longer believe in the very heartbeat of the faith, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So that's one dimension of the battle, is that bishops who are not engaging in sexual degeneracy are likely elevated to their positions simply because they fit the Masonic description of someone who carries those liberal ideals. The more sinister layer that we are faced with is a literal clandestine network of agents who operate to undermine the faith and who pull the strings. Those are people like Cardinal McCarrick, like Cardinal Cody, Cardinal Law, Daniels, Casper, Bea, Bonini, Pope Paul VI, Pope Francis. These are the men who know what they are doing. These are the men who participate in secret societies, who view Lucifer through the Kabbalistic lens, that of a light bearer. These esoteric societies that belong to the elite all have a core belief that Lucifer is both the Holy Spirit and Satan, that they are one and the same, as above, so below. They see Lucifer as the intelligent liberator and savior of mankind from pure animalism. They see the institution of the Catholic Church as the gatekeeper to ultimate spiritual knowledge. They are theosophists who have lost their way a long time ago. They don't see the world the same way we do, the Catholic worldview. They see anything immoral. They don't see anything immoral with homosexuality. That view extends to children. They see themselves as gods, living amongst animals. Like St. Maximilian Kolbe once said, doesn't the Antichrist not have followers too? Won't Lucifer also have himself an army? He does. And that army is in every position of power across the globe. And many of Satan's lieutenants are in the Vatican. And look what they have accomplished in the last 100 years. In 1917, in a quiet field near the Portuguese village of Fatima, Our Lady appeared to 3 shepherd children. The Blessed Mother had given the children a third and final secret with explicit instructions. It was to be revealed to the world in 1960, for by that time, she said, it will be better understood. That was the year when humanity would be ready to comprehend its meaning. So the faithful waited. 1960 arrived, and what happened? Pope John the 23rd, the pontiff, whose enthronement in 1958 was marked ominously by a lunar eclipse, chose not to reveal the secret given by the Lady of the Sun. Instead, he announced something unprecedented, the Second Vatican Council, and in his announcements condemned Fatima. Indirectly, but we know who he was referring to. And he called them prophets of gloom, for it was Sister Lucia who was telling us to prepare for the great chastisement. If you want to pause this video now and leave me for a worthy rabbit hole, I will fully endorse it. Go look at the YouTube channel, Sister Lucy Truth. They have proven, beyond any doubt, that the Sister Lucy of Fatima was replaced by an impostor in the 60s. They gather reports from plastic surgeons, from dentists. One report from the Guinness Book of World Record holder, a forensic sketch artist in Houston. They gather reports from various experts in their field, and they all conclude that when you present the 2 different photos of Sister Lucia, they are 2 different people. A child could see the profile photos of the 2 and conclude with human intelligence. They do not pass the test of the naked eye. But this YouTube channel settles it entirely. And no, The jawline does not move that far in the aging process, nor can dental work or dentures account for the obvious differences in the chin line of the two women. They also bring up famous photos of Sister Lucia with Pope Paul VI and Pope John Paul II. And then they show original photos that they found revealing how they were photoshops, images given to the masses. The latest from them is that Dr. Hoynovsky presented this case to the Ohio State Coroners Conference. This is the latest. Coroners who are doctors, coroners investigate the deaths of people who died unexpectedly or suspiciously. They are professionals who conduct work for legal cases. And at this conference, where over 100 professionals were in attendance, they later wrote a letter to Sister Lucy Truth, concluding what we're saying here, that these are two different people. Sister Lucy, the seer of Fatima, one of the most important figures of the church, certainly in the last 100 years, who was given a message by Our Lady about a great chastisement that was coming to the world. The message was held by men in the church who not only disobeyed the order to release the message, but then replaced Sister Lucy with an impostor to push the Vatican II narrative. I understand how hard all of this might be to take in, but psychological operations are not a new thing, and there have been far more sophisticated ones carried out against us, like 9/11. This information is not meant for you to lose the faith. If anything, all of this has made me more steadfast and devout. For the true reality is finally before us, and it's as liberating as it is concerning. Before moving on, I'll give you one of the final words from the Sister Lucy, the real Sister Lucy, in 1957. She said, quote, "Father, the Most Holy Virgin is very sad because no one has paid any attention to her message, neither the good nor the bad. The good continue on their way, but without giving any importance to her message. The bad, not seeing the punishment of God actually falling on them, continue their life of sin without even caring about the message. But believe me, Father, God will chastise the world, and this will be in a terrible manner. The punishment from heaven is imminent." End quote. That was said after World War II. Here's to falling skies. The two people that I believe are central to shattering this satanic narrative and reality are Sister Lucia and St. Maximilian Kolbe, because their lives have been hijacked, and the truth of their life, if looked at even for a moment, reveals the very criminals who have usurped their names after death. St. Maximilian Kolbe writes very clearly and boldly who the enemies are. They are the Jews, and they are the Freemasons who work for the Jews. All this is archived. He says this. These are his words. Every word that came from the fraudulent Sister Lucia reveals the lie. In 1969, Sister Lucy writes a strongly worded letter demanding complete obedience to Paul VI, who, don't forget, was the most destructive popes in the history of the church. And in 1992, she gives an interview saying that the third secret was only meant for the Pope in 1960 and not to the public, and that the third secret was fulfilled with the assassination attempt of JP2. She said the Novus Ordo liturgy is valid, and of all the things to add, she said that the Jews are still God's chosen people, something that was never said from the church until the year 1960. Sometimes they make it easy for us to spot them. Last point on this. Please do not forget how Christ will treat the lukewarm Catholics. They will be chewed up and spit from his mouth. I am trying to show the crisis. It's as serious and grave. Sister Lucia and St. Maximilian Kolbe are the two clear examples that show the crime goes to the popes. The sex scandals, financial crimes come from the Pope down. Just because it's hard to believe or to comprehend doesn't make it any less true. I'm talking to my comrades, the sons of the church, grown boys who have been raised by weak men. We are cursed with knowledge. We are burdened with responsibility to act. Prayer is not the only answer. We need to get physical, lest we watch our children be torn apart by wolves and experience what it's like to be spit from the mouth of God. It's the whole point of this channel, however long it will last, to sound the alarm while we still have time, while we still have hope. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. I love that poem. The best answer is to study Kolbe. He lays out the instructions. Raise the banner of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in your life and in your community. She is the general in this final battle, and those under her banner will be given the sweet crown of martyrdom. Is there any other crown worth wearing when the story of salvation is retold? And let's not kid ourselves. In this slop of modern society, martyrdom might be our only path to secure salvation. So let's digress. To Sister Lucia and St. Maximilian Kolbe, give us strength. We need your courage. All right, let's digress. Hold this image in your mind. The abuse scandals that erupted around the world, the moral collapse, the abuses to children, the silence, the protection of predators, the rise of clerics elevated because of their crimes, their complicity, and their loyal to a new permissive culture within the church, reflected the deeper fracture that had already opened. What was proclaimed as an opening up to the world, a gesture of renewal meant to modernize the faith and draw people back to the church, became instead a careful dismantling. The liturgy was stripped of its ancient language and solemnity. Mystery gave way to emotion. The sacred became casual. The altar was turned from the east to face the people. It was the perfect strategy to separate generations from the living memory of tradition, to make the young forget what their ancestors believed, what they prayed, what they worshipped, to weaken belief by dilution. The Second Vatican Council claimed to offer an update, but what followed was not continuity, it was rupture. A break from centuries of Catholic liturgy, devotion, and identity. And history teaches this bitter truth. If you wish to destroy a nation, you first erase its history and rewrite its culture. The same is true for faith. The Council's documents themselves may stand as valid theology, to which I hold. But what was implemented was something else entirely, and practice makes policy. The beauty and mystery that once saturated the Mass, the sense of sacrifice and transcendence, was replaced with a Protestant performance. The result was spiritual desolation. Churches emptied. Vocations vanished. The body of Christ was wounded by the slow erosion of belief from within. People varied different churches based on the homily and the guitar band, shopping parishes like Protestants, until eventually they were essentially given permission to stop going to Mass altogether in 2020. And now many people think that the live stream service counts as their obligation. The altar was replaced with a depressing table. The holy sacrifice of the Mass, once the real metaphysical place of Calvary, was reformed as a communal meal. Across the world, churches spent hundreds of millions of dollars tearing out the altar rails, moving tabernacles from the high altar to some side chapel or a corner niche away from the center. This is the beating heart of the sanctuary, and it was quietly displaced. The language of the angels, Latin, the sacred tongue for centuries, was muted in favor of the vernacular. Prayers that spoke of sin, sacrifice, and the intercession of the dead were omitted entirely or rewritten to de-emphasize the gravity. The ancient liturgy, once dense with theology and mystery, was stripped down to something that could fit within the modern mind in modern time. And almost immediately came the push for communion in the hand as the standard, introduced by bishops eager to appear modern. Then came Eucharistic ministers, ordinary lay people distributing what Catholics always have called the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. St. Thomas Aquinas had taught that only that which is consecrated could touch that which is consecrated, that the priest, transformed by ordination, alone could handle the sacred host. His fingers and thumb and forefinger were consecrated for that purpose, and the tongue of the baptized in the old rite became consecrated in order to properly receive the host. So why the change? Because form shapes belief. You alter the physical gestures, you alter the faith. Diminish the reverence, you diminish the sense of the sacred. Remove the veil, and the mystery vanishes. The other sacraments followed the same path. The rites of baptism, marriage, confirmation, anointing of the sick, ordination were rewritten by Freemasons. Exorcisms that once expelled the very ties of Freemasonry and other evil spirits from catechumens were removed or softened. Prayers of sacrifice, atonement, and intercession were replaced with language of fellowship and community. The drama of the supernatural gave way to the language of fraternity, of humanism, of the world. And with that, the desacralization spread beyond the liturgy. Religious orders abandoned their habits, those visible signs of consecration that set humbly them apart from the world. Disciplines were relaxed. Fasting, silence, and penance gave way to social activism and feminist movements. The cloister turned into the classroom, and the mission field became a stage of social commentary. And the numbers tell us the story. In the 1950s, roughly 3 out of every 4 Catholics attended Sunday Mass. By all metrics, before Vatican II, the church was thriving. Today, fewer than 1 in 5 attend Mass, from 75% to less than 20%. Confession lines dried up. Vocations to the priesthood and religious life have fallen sharply. The spirit of ecumenism, meant to foster dialogue, became instead a new relativism. Many Catholics began to believe that all religions were equal paths to the same God, that salvation could be found anywhere and everywhere, that the Church's ancient claim of being the one true path was to be downplayed or denied. And the architects of the new liturgy understood something fundamental. How we worship determines what we believe. Change the form, and you change the faith. The sacred teaches the soul. When the sacred is stripped away, the soul forgets what it was made for. Now, I know many will rise to defend the recent popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and I understand why. They inherited chaos, and we want to believe that they did what they could to shepherd a fractured flock. Both men faced the tangled web of the Vatican Bank scandal and were intimately aware of the names that reached back to the death of John Paul I. and the growing suspicion that secret networks still moved within the Curia. Whether they were reformers restrained by politics or captains trying to steer a damaged ship, history and heaven will judge. I want to be fair when I speak about John Paul II. Part of me hopes that he himself was a product of the new world that the Alta Vendita had described, a man formed in an age saturated with modern propaganda. He was raised in Poland, an area that experienced the most violence in human history. The location where he grew up had a major Jewish population. More specifically, the world's Ashkenazi Jewish population resided in Poland and Ukraine. And as children, you become who you spend your time with. And many of his close friends were Ashkenazi. I won't speak on the levels of that influence today because I'm still learning it. But it is safe to say he was a product of the age. Born in a traditional world with liberal ideals forming his thoughts and belief. When choosing a man who embodied the spirit of Vatican II and ecumenism, it was him. He seemed like a man who believed the press and the propaganda, as everyone else did in those times. This video is not a close look on his life and his intentions, but it's clear he was not totally blind to the evil. He confronted the communists directly, which my argument is that this was theater for the masses when you consider all the behind-the-scenes collaboration with the leaders. I'm still working my way through his particular involvement with the Vatican Bank and the money laundering. The information I have shows participation as well as resistance, but the resistance that seems to be for his own benefit, not compelled by moral conviction. If you're willing to concede that the official story behind the assassination of JFK is not the result of a lone gunman, but a conspiracy of our own government and other foreign elements to remove him, then I hope you can grasp that the assassination attempt of JP2 was another CIA plot to kill him and to blame the communists. Or it was all a show, with JP2 as the main actor. Only heaven knows. That web is unorganized, and I'm still working through it. But it seems he definitely did not play well with others, and they sought his removal. And I can't sit here and pretend to have the answers around him. And until I know for sure, I can't be too harsh. However, I have been quite critical about him, and now I'm about to swing pretty hard at him. So, brace for impact. Many of his actions contradict the portrayal of his papacy. A big one is his cooperation with the obvious fraud, Sister Lucy. What man of goodwill and intent can play along with a satanic plot to undermine the Fatima message? If she was replaced with an impostor, which it's obvious that she was, then he is not just complicit in the deception, he is guilty. He wasn't duped like people on TV or the people who could see her at a distance. He and his clique were part of the cover-up. They were the ones orchestrating it. He and the fake Sister Lucy stood before the world, knowing they were deceiving the faithful, and they were gently steering the young generation into a new, weak, and wicked world. A world where all religions find favor with God, where all religions, like all men, are equal. And so they stood like good actors and played the world. It's audacious. John Paul II brought the fake Sister Lucy out in public multiple times to push the Vatican II spirit on the people. And once you see that operation, it'll make you ill to see the people fall for it. And history, the records of history, remembers decisions that cannot be ignored. Choices made in the name of diplomacy, unity, or mercy that carried devastating consequences. In the spirit of ecumenism and institutional preservation, Pope John Paul II has made insidious changes. He altered canon law, softening the penalties for clergy found guilty of abuse to children. That single reform would echo through every abuse case that followed. How does one make sense of that change? This is a cognitive dissonance here. Why would protection be made to the criminals rather than stricter punishments? Under his pontificate, Theodore McCarrick, whose predatory behavior was widely known in church circles, was promoted to Archbishop of Washington and then to Cardinal. This pattern repeated. Those who abuse are elevated into higher positions of authority. I understand that there have been predators throughout church history, but when they are discovered, they are removed entirely with severe punishments. It is unprecedented to promote the predators. Then came Martial Maciel, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ. Credible accusations against him dated back to the 70s, claims of abusing hundreds of children, of systematic sexual abuse of seminarians, and the creation of a network that protected each other. Yet during those years, with the knowledge of his scandal fully in the ears of Rome, Maciel was publicly praised by Pope John Paul II. And he encouraged him to expand his order into one of the wealthiest in the church, making hundreds of millions. It was not until 2006, under Benedict, that Maciel was finally removed from ministry. The world remembers the Boston scandal. More than 1,000 victims and 200 accused priests exposed by journalists in 2002. The archbishop at the center, Cardinal Bernard Law, resigned under pressure. Instead of being disciplined for protecting pedophiles, he was brought to Rome and placed in charge of one of the city's major basilicas, an appointment that stunned survivors and the faithful. A similar story in Los Angeles, where Cardinal Roger Mahony faced evidence of widespread cover-ups. Again, the Vatican shielded him from prosecution as a Vatican sovereign and they maintained his standing. We already discussed these events, and they were systematic procedures that protected the criminals rather than the innocent. There were others. Hans Hermann Grower, Archbishop of Vienna, forced to resign after revelations of abusing thousands of young boys. A procession of lesser-known names, each representing unaccounted lives of damage. During John Paul II's 26-year papacy, more than 6,000 priests worldwide were credibly accused of sexual abuse. Yet disciplinary measures remained very low, and with his changes to canon law, the penalties grew lighter. When we look back, the tragedy is not only the crimes themselves, but the loss of moral authority they inflicted. A papacy that inspired the fall of communism also presided over the rise of the internal darkness, one that faith alone could not excuse. And that's unfortunately not all. When Pope John Paul I died, JP2 inherited the same financial laundering machine that was set up with Paul VI. Yet instead of dismantling it, he left the principal figures in place. Neither Archbishop Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, nor Roberto Calvi, the financier at the center of Banco Ambrosiano, were removed. And JP2 could not have been unaware. Within months of his election, a 12-member investigation team from the Bank of Italy launched a full-scale probe into Banco Ambrosiano, in which the Vatican held a controlling interest. The team's 500-page dossier detailed an intricate web of offshore shell companies and delicate operations abroad. When experts of the report leaked, the Banco Ambrosiano stock collapsed by 30%. Criminal proceedings followed. Arrest warrants were issued to Paul Marcinkus, who was protected under the sovereign state of the Vatican. And Italy's treasury minister personally met with the Secretary of State, Cardinal Casaroli, Mason. urging the Vatican to sever ties with the bank. The matter was presented to the Pope, but no action was taken. 3 years later, the remaining shareholders of Banco Ambrosiano wrote directly to John Paul II in Polish so he could read it. Their letter pleaded for reform, to dismiss Marcinkus and Calvi, close the networks of the shell companies, and end the fraudulent transfers carried out under the Vatican. 7 months after receiving that letter, the Pope responded, not by removing Marcinkus, but by promoting him to the president of the Pontifical Commission under Vatican State, the governor of the Vatican, while keeping his position as the head of the IOR. The decision left everyone with their jaws on the floor. Italy's treasury had issued warnings. The Bank of Italy's audit had exposed fraud, and lists of P2 Masons members were circulating the press, including Marcinkus. Still, nothing changed. The financial situation worsened, and shell companies multiplied. Why would he ignore such evidence? During the same years, JP2 was meeting with CIA Director William Casey, the Iran-Contra affair Casey, and President Ronald Reagan, the man who was trafficking orphan boys into the White House from Boys Town, Nebraska, per the Franklin scandal. Look that up. They were meeting to coordinate financial support for the Solidarity movement in Poland, an effort to undermine communist control of Eastern Europe. When the Vatican Bank was making a 15% commission on deposits from Pablo Escobar, you know about it. The Pope knew about it. He knew that the drug money was coming from the cartel and the CIA. Regardless of what he did with that information, he knew. And then came the image that symbolized, for many, the confusion of the age. In 1999, standing over the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi, Pope John Paul II bent down and kissed the Quran, a gesture meant as respect, yet by the traditionalists as the final sign of a church willing to embrace every faith but its own. And the irony was painful. A pope who had inspired millions with ecumenism, who had faced down totalitarianism and presided over an institutional entangled in the very wickedness it once renounced, the light of his charisma could not hide the shadows behind the throne. And I won't go into him, but what did Pope Benedict XVI do? I have to save him for another time, but we know what he did. He left us. He quit. When we step back and face the evidence, honestly, we see that the crisis is not an isolated wound. It is not the work of a few bad apples, rotting in the shadows and stinking the place up. It is a system, a hierarchy that has quietly operated for generations across the world. Hundreds of cardinals, thousands of bishops, and priests either abused children, abused one another, or covered up for those who did. And that makes them no less guilty. It makes them accomplices in a crime that is worse than murder, the abuse of children. The records we have show a deliberate, coordinated pattern of cover-up reaching back at least to the Second World War. And decade after decade, the hierarchy, all the way to Rome, knew and protected the criminals. That is evil. One of the reasons this has not been fully exposed or confronted, I believe, is because credible reports indicate that the Vatican Curia and their congregation of bishops have long been shaped by a homosexual subculture. For generations, men with that inclination have been intentionally elevated into positions of authority. And when the most corrupt or godless among them are caught or suspected, the good bishops and cardinals those who struggle privately with those sins, remain silent, terrified that their own skeletons would be dragged into the light. That is the power of blackmail, to rule quietly through fear, collect the dirt, promote the dirty, and you ensure the devil will never meet resistance. So if there is a good bishop hearing this, a man who knows exactly what I'm describing, please listen to the voices of the Catholic faithful. To the man who ended up in this predicament, we do not care what you are guilty of. Christ forgives, we forgive. If you fear losing your reputation for the sake of defending children and the bride of Christ, understand that one loss is infinitely worse in heaven's eyes. Humiliation in this life is a sweet perfume that radiates in eternity. Be humble. Accept your sins. Every one of us is fallen. Every one of us is a degenerate sinner. We are begging God to raise bishops who will put their pride to death, put their ego to death. Lay down your reputation and die for us. Please, die for us. That's the only reason you wear the mitre at all. Do you not see the battle we are in? Do you not see the field you are standing on? This is how the fight is won. Through humility, through sacrifice, through the willingness to be embarrassed for the sake of truth. And to the bishops who still have a conscience left, tear away that veil of excuses you have woven over the years. You know the reality far better than we do. A man may live his whole life as a coward and still die a hero and be remembered as one. What we are seeing and experiencing is not simply a liberal element nor a clash of confused people with different theological opinions. That is the decoy. That's the ultima vendita op. The church as it functions institutionally, the hierarchy itself, the very lattice work of bishops and cardinals is corrupted to the core. For the faithful priests who long to resist, the moment they try, find themselves powerless, silenced, or killed. And that powerlessness is the proof. The enemy holds the reins. Today, the church operates less like the bride of Christ and more like a shell company, a structure where bishops and cardinals enrich themselves, launder money, prey on children and each other, hide their crimes, and then gaslight the faithful. This is not the exception. Rewind the video. This has become the institution. The corruption within the hierarchy, the abuse scandals, the financial crimes, the moral collapse inside the Curia and its teachings reflect the same disease St. Francis and Assisi and Dante condemned in the 13th century. Then as now, the papal court was overrun with aristocrats, noble families driven by politics, bloodlines, worldly motives. Nepotism, simony, and greed ruled the age. Cardinals live like princes. Popes trade spiritual authority like indulgences for political leverage and financial gain. And the bride of Christ was disfigured by wealth and ambition. All argued as the will of God in the wake of Constantine. We accepted it as normal, but it never was. Dante placed multiple popes in the flames of hell for these sins. St. Francis and his brothers cried with one voice that the church must be poor, humble, apostolic, not a worldly empire. The difference is that in the 13th century, the church stood at a crossroads. She could have chosen internal reform. She could have embraced the Franciscan call to poverty and holiness. Instead, she tightened her grip on power and crushed those who dared to speak of a pure renewal. And what followed? The Protestant Reformation, the fracturing of Christendom, and a satanic infiltration that has persisted through the centuries. Every good lie needs to be wrapped in the truth. The Protestant religion is a great lie, wrapped in legit grievances of the church. And today, this warning returns, but written in far darker ink. The sex abuse crisis is not an accident. It is the inevitable fruit of a hierarchy that long ago chose wealth, influence, and political power over sanctity. And the truth is that that's not the worst of it. When the church rejected the call of St. Francis, when she clung to money, ambition, and the wheels of empire, she opened the door to centuries of compromise. That compromise allowed generation after generation of power-hungry men to ascend within her hierarchy, each layer adding to a seemingly unbreakable foundation of corruption. And by the 20th century, that playbook had reached the very top. The men entrusted to defend the faith instead used their authority to transform it. It is one thing for cardinals to live as princes or for popes to barter with kings. That alone is scandal. But it is something far worse when bishops and cardinals take it upon themselves to rewrite the worship of God. The sacred liturgy, handed down through centuries of saints and martyrs, was stripped, diluted, and reduced to a Protestant-style gathering, rather than upheld as the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The altar was desacralized, and homilies became the climax of the Mass, which were just subtle platforms for confusion and heresy. In the past, the church endured the chaos of politics and power. Today, the remnant endures moral chaos and doctrinal collapse. And the only ones who will see the truth clearly are the traditional faithful, those who cling to what was entrusted to them, who refuse to trade sacred tradition for novelty. It is the faithful Catholics who now stand where St. Francis and Dante stood, crying out to the shepherds of the bride of Christ to turn back before judgment falls. I hope that whoever is still listening, the person who has made it this far, will carefully weigh the words. Please understand, I speak with the same gravity carried in the unfulfilled warnings of Fatima. I speak with the gravity of Sister Agnes in Akita, Japan. And if the words of Our Lady still have a due date, then we need to prepare ourselves. We all do. This is not hyperbole. I cannot say for certain whether we are at the end of the world, but it certainly feels that way. And even that feeling could be engineered, because the people who run the world are using Revelation as the playbook. The people who run the world believe of the arrival in their Messiah, which only means our Antichrist. Things are not going to get better. This is not how momentum works. The enemies of the church and of humanity have been winning since the First World War, and they have shaped multiple generations since the Second. Christians are losing, and if you want a glimpse of to what is coming, look back at the Bolshevik Revolution. That blueprint has been dormant in our perception, but it has been molding generations through universities and the media for the last 75 years. The facade of democracy is beginning to crack. Meanwhile, atheists and nihilists had been building quietly on the dark web, forming evil networks, encouraged in online groups like 764. We have watched governments and courts deliver lenient sentences to criminals while publishing defenders of family and society with severity. Hate speech and self-defense will be prosecuted with the utmost force. I am not making predictions, but I will tell you how the future appears to me. At some point, there will be a cyber attack. The internet will go down. Possibly the entire power grid will collapse, because that is the only way to conquer a nation with more guns than any other on earth. You cannot invade America, but you can starve it, just as the Holodomor starved millions. With the grid down and the ports shut, the country can starve to death. And when they decide to bring everything back online, nothing will be the same. The internet, created by DARPA, the lawless frontier it once was, will be gone. In its place, the Promise-style software and artificial intelligence, the digital world will be policed and monitored like China's system. I can see it already. Every time you log in, you will have to agree to the terms and conditions. And slowly, inevitably, Christians will be labeled domestic terrorists. And unless we renounce our beliefs, we will be denied access to the internet, which will be declared a safe space. a space where our extremist views will not be tolerated. And very soon, Christians will be pressured, subtly at first, to renounce their faith to access Amazon, Netflix, their bank accounts. And those who refuse will find themselves pushed to the margins of society, into poverty and persecution. This is the future. There's no stopping it unless heaven intervenes. And those of you who live every day in the world of Microsoft Teams know exactly what I mean. You already police your own words. You watch what you type in the chat, terrified of being exposed as a conservative Christian. You sit through the quarterly LGBT indoctrination sessions. You get paid to bear false witness. Slowly, your soul is worn down into submission, and the drip, drip, drip never stops. It keeps going until your very body is divided into carbon credits and you end up selling yourself to the banks for more digital currency. And when I say that the solution to this crisis, to this infiltration of the church, is poverty, I mean it literally. I believe poverty can save the world. If a handful of poor, humble apostles once converted the Roman Empire, imagine the fire that would consume the entire world if the Curia laid aside its wealth, put on the habit, and raised the banner of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. St. Bonaventure said of St. Francis, as Christ's disciple, he strove to regard himself as worthless in his own eyes and those of others. That must become the church's attitude, because the church has already made itself worthless. The Catholic Church is beyond infection. It has decayed, and it is foul. And the only way to save her is to cast off the power, abandon the riches, give everything away, and put on the habit. Follow Christ. Follow his mother. Follow the apostles. Follow the Franciscans. As for us, the fate of the faithful is already written. Persecution, forced poverty, those who refuse the vaccines, those who refuse to announce their faith with a click of a button will lose everything. We will become vile in the eyes of the world. We will be hated. To what degree? Ask the Palestinians. Look at the Russians. Look at the Germans. Ask the early Christians in the catacombs. This is the future. There's no stopping it. So we have to make peace with that reality. What the faithful cannot bear, what they dread more than persecution, is betrayal from the church. We have been experiencing it in tiny increments our entire lives, but we all tasted a harsher dose of that betrayal in 2020, when churches were locked down to appease the narrative many of us recognized as false from the very beginning. I do not want to witness a church that turns its back on the faithful. Yet, with the spread of ecumenism infecting every corner, that's precisely my fear. But it does not have to be this way. The church can choose to stand with the persecuted. She can refuse to wire herself to the artificial digital matrix rising around us. For that to happen, the church must cast off her jewels, her political crowns, her obsession with temporal power. For these have brought salvation. They've brought scandal. For all my days, I will cherish the Rome of old, the cathedrals, the sculptures, the beauty carved by faith. But where are the souls? Is it accurate to say that our church is in a state of mortal sin? That our church needs a public exorcism? The people are as lifeless as the stone statues. And the tourists come for their own kind, for statues that cannot feel, cannot breathe, cannot convert. The walls of the Vatican are filled with nihilism. The church is not strongest when she rules, but when she serves. When a body is constantly fed, it grows fat, and fat bodies attract cancers and parasites. For over 1,000 years, the body of Christ has been infected with disease. We must fast. We must purge. We must sacrifice the worldly cathedrals, for they will not stand forever anyways. Only through poverty and hunger will disease leave the body, for parasites cannot feed on the spirit alone. The vaults of the Vatican must be emptied. The poverty of Bethlehem and Calvary must be taken up again. That is the path forward. That is our only path forward. If the price For all our cathedrals and marble art was to the abandonment of one soul, then we have paid far too much. Rome is not the church. The cathedrals are not the church. All of that is but ash. Monuments to the kingdom of men. Kingdoms Christ himself spoke against. The church must return to the sandals of Peter, and the laymen have the power to compel Rome back to poverty. Let the shepherds shed their royal garments. Let them pick up the crook and seek out the lost. May we lose all in order to gain Christ. God bless you all.